we got a lot of energy in the room today. I love it. It must be that beautiful sunshine of ours. Welcome. We're so glad you're here. It's so good to see you. And good morning to those of us joining online. We're happy you're here. I'd like to invite you to sing with us this morning. Storm or drought on the rock that does not move. I will set my hope in your love, oh Lord, and your faithfulness will prove. You are the word you spoke, all the starry hosts are called out by name each night. In your watchful care, I will rest secure as you lead us with your light. You are steadfast, you are steadfast. In the moment of emptiness, all was fulfilled. In the hour of darkness, your light was revealed. In the presence of death, your life was affirmed. In the absence of holiness, you are still God. You are steadfast, you are steadfast. Amen. You can be seated.
Good morning. Okay, I need extra energy today because I'm freezing cold, and it just feels like an extra energy necessitating type of morning. Good morning. When in doubt, thank you, kids. My name is Jeremy. I'm the pastor here of the Grove, Cottage Grove, and it is really good to be with you, hopefully giving you a little bit of warmth on this cold Minnesota morning. You might notice things are a little bit different this morning. Katie Eckeberger and her husband Katie, who are usually up here leading, are on vacation. They were in Texas this past week visiting Jacob's family because they were not able to be with them over Christmas. So we're thankful that they were able to have that break, and we're also thankful that Legend was able to come lead for us this morning. In any case, it is great to be with you. We're a brand new church that exists to grow goodness. And so we hope that you're being here in the room with us, you are watching with us online, wherever you're at, whether you are at home or somewhere warm or anywhere in between, that somehow we are nurturing healing, wholeness, and beauty in your life.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jordan, and I'm one of the worship leaders here at the Grove. I'd like to bring your attention to the little handout that you were given to when you walked in this morning. If you open that up, there's a little insert, and this is your opportunity to give us your contact information so that we can get information to you about the Grove. And then if you look on the back, there's a whole bunch of boxes. If you're interested in certain things, you can check those boxes and we can make sure that we get that information to you. And then also in the worship handout, in the bottom corner, there's information about giving. There's lots of different ways to give here at the Grove. You can give in person. Along with the handout, those in-person gifts can be put in the baskets on your way out. You can also give online. There's a little QR code there, or through Venmo.
With that worship insert in hand that Jordan was just referring to, I'll have you grab this with your other hand and flip it to the back, because the back has these 3 panels, which are the 3 most important things that we want you to key in on this month. And believe it or not, this first month of the year is almost done, so some of these things are like coming due. The first one is Beautiful Mess. This is the series that we're in. You're going to be hearing a lot more about that. One of the things that we're doing as a part of this series is we're hearing from people who are part of our congregation, sharing some of their own messy stories of faith. And one of our hopes is not just that you get to hear some of the stories from our congregation, but also for you to start thinking through your own story in a way where you're able to reflect on what has happened to you, where God has been at work in your life, and maybe how you can share that story with other people as well in a meaningful way. If you are interested in learning more about how to do that, you're like, I have this story, but I don't really know how to articulate it. You can take that worship insert and write on the back story, and we will follow up with you. There's going to be more resources coming out in the next couple weeks that we're going to share to help you to do that. But if you would like help doing that now, I would love to have a conversation with you about how you can do that. The second thing is Pajama Ball. Pajama Ball is an event that we put on. This is our second year of doing it, where it is an evening of, we clear out all of these pews and we transform it into a dance floor. So there's dancing and activities and crafts and costumes. Either you can come in pajamas or you can come in superhero costumes or royalty costumes or any type of costume that you want. It's just a fun opportunity for us to get together and do something for our community. That is coming up on February 10th. Crazy, but not this Friday, but the next Friday after that already, which is wild. So one, we tell you about this so that you can plan to attend it yourself or to invite other people, but we also mention it because we're still looking for volunteers to be able to help with this event. You might hear this and you're like, I would be willing to help with it, but I don't want anything to do with those crazy kids. We have positions for you. You can come early and set up, you can come late and clean up, and you don't have to interact with any of the crazy kids. Or you might be like, I want to be involved with those crazy kids because I'm one of those crazy kids. You might be 20 years old, you might be 70 years old, and you're like, I'm one of those crazy kids and I want to get in the mix with those crazy kids. We've got opportunities for you too. So if you would be interested in volunteering, you can either go to that link that's right there, or you can fill out the worship insert and then select community events, and we will follow up with you to get you connected with the information that you need to know about for that event. The last thing is becoming a partner. To be a partner is simply to say that you see the Grove as your church family and that you want to contribute to this being your church family and act as if you are part of the family. We have an event coming up on February 12th, so the second Sunday of the month, immediately following worship, where we're going to have what we call a hello and welcome, where it's an opportunity for you to learn more about the Grove, all that entails, our history and where we're trying to go from here, but then also what it means for you to be a partner. If you are interested in that, you can, again, fill out the worship insert and check the back box that says become a partner, I think is what it is. And then again, if you fill it out and check any of those things, you can drop it in the offering basket after the service.
Obviously, kids are very valued here at the Grove. We have lots of different opportunities for kids. In the front of your pews, there's little clipboards with activity sheets. Adults, don't be ashamed to use these as well. We also have our little wiggle space off to the side where there's fun, quiet activities to be doing while they're here in worship. We do have a staff nursery for 6 weeks to 3 years old. And then we also have Grove kids that will be sent out in a little bit. We sing a little special song. They head out where they can build relationships and learn together. If it is your first time going to Grove Kids, we just ask that you fill out this registration form so that we have your information if something were to happen, information on allergies, that kind of a thing. So you can just send that out with your child as they head out.
Last thing is we have this part of our service called Connection Point. Introverts' least favorite part of the service. This is where we make you interact with the people around you. And it's good for you. And you will like it because we're going to make you do it anyways. As a new church, it is really important to build relationships, even if it's just over a simple question. So in just a minute, we're going to have you stand up, find somebody that you don't know or don't know well near you, introduce yourself. Hopefully you're able to do that. And then we give you the question to be able to discuss together. So today's question is, what's your favorite winter activity, both inside and outside? On days like this, when it's, 20 below wind chill right now, and it's apparently going to be even colder tomorrow, what is a favorite activity that you have inside, but then what's something when it's cold outside during these Minnesota winters that you really like to do outside? All right, got it? So we'll give you a couple minutes, stand up, find somebody near you that you don't know or don't know very well, introduce yourself, and discuss that question. We'll reconvene in just a couple minutes. All right, you can go ahead and find your seat. Introverts' least favorite part of the service, extroverts' favorite part of the service. So we are part of what's called the United Methodist Church, and we're part of this tradition that draws its past all the way back to a guy named John Wesley. And one of the things that John Wesley was adamant about that we have picked up on and that continues to inform our approach to life and faith is this idea that it is important to have both what's called individual holiness and social holiness. What he meant by that is it's important for us as individuals to be doing things as followers of Jesus as individuals and make sure that our own lives are being transformed, but also the social holiness in that it's important for us to be acting in just ways in the world and to be impacting the world in an ongoing fashion. And so that was something that he was committed to, that the people who followed his tradition were committed to, that we are convinced is actually also a fundamental part of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And so when things come up, justice-related issues come up, we don't skirt around them. We view it as an integral part of what it means to be a church and to be individual followers of Jesus. And that's true for all of us, including our little kids. So one of the books that we have right out here in the Commons area, available for our kids, is called "Something Happened in Our Town: A Child's Story About Racial Injustice." And so even for our little kids, we want them to be able to have conversations around racial injustice. If you've been paying attention at all to the news from the past week, you've probably heard about what is going on in Memphis and with the death specifically of Tyree Nichols. And so we wanted to acknowledge that as people of faith and as a church. And last year, actually, right around this time, we had a prayer that was written for us specifically in response to the death of Amir Locke. And it was called A Liturgy for Our Justice Commitment. And fortunately, unfortunately, it remains a pretty timely thing. It remains a pretty timely prayer. And we can pretty easily switch out names, and it is still fitting for the world and the situation in which we live in and for us as followers of Jesus. So at this heavy time in response to this event and to the death specifically of Tyree Nichols, I wanted to make sure that we addressed it and that we read through this liturgy for our justice commitment. So with that in mind, will you pray with me? God, who created all to be in harmony, in shalom, and yet sees the conflict and injustices in our world, in our country, even at times in our hometown. Today we come to you with various emotions and thoughts regarding the events of this week. Some of us are disturbed and disheartened by yet another death of a black man. We've seen it too many times to be surprised, too many times to think that this will be the last. Some of us are heartbroken that this is a problem, that life has become so valueless that cutting one short is commonplace, that a child, a sibling, a cousin, a friend now is gone forever, that death has won in a violent act. Others of us don't have much to say about this. For what we think and feel might seem unkind. For those of us who hear of it on the news, yet it has little impact on our daily lives due to where we live, where we spend our time, where we feel safe. As we reflect and put our focus on the injustice and ongoing repercussions of a racial divide, we understand that this systemic issue is one that began long before us, but that also persists due to our lack of action. Jesus, show us in small, tangible, eye-opening ways how we play a role in these tragedies of injustice, how our perspectives and experiences are shaped by our privilege, our status, our discomforts. Spirit, make things uncomfortable for us that we won't remain still, that we will be moved to speak up, to stand out, to demand some systemic change, to declare that this is not the peace you desire, the neighborly love you taught. Let us be the neighbor that steps out, that knocks on the door to introduce ourselves, to listen and to get to know each other, the time to grow close, for protection, for relationship, to pause for a moment of prayer together. Yet for now, in silence, we pause to grieve the loss of Tyree Nichols. As we end our silence, we speak up as one people looking for guidance to our calling. We ask you, Spirit, to reveal our privilege and biases that we might confess. We ask you, Jesus, to show us the door on which we should knock. We ask you, Creator, to bring new life and new hope out of this tragedy. Don't let us miss this opportunity again. Amen.
Thank you, Jeremy. If you're able, I'd like to invite you to stand and join me as we dismiss our kids. So sweet. They brought such a sweet energy to the room this morning. That was beautiful. We're going to continue to sing. Come taste and see that the Lord is good. His love for me never runs out. Come taste and see that the Lord is good. He's always good. His love for me never runs out. Come taste and see that the Lord is good. He's always good. Lord, we believe that in our hearts and our minds and our souls this morning. We thank you for how good and gracious and forgiving you are. In our worst moments and in our best moments, Lord, you are always there, always present, always waiting when we wander, and ready to embrace us when we come home. Lord, we love you. Thank you for joining us in this space this morning. Thank you for the sunshine and the joy that it's brought. May you be honored and glorified in this place today. It's in your name we pray. Amen. You can be seated.
As I mentioned earlier, a part of what we're doing in this series is we are each week having one person from the congregation come up and talk about their own messy story of faith. Because we all have messy stories of faith. We're going to get into these stories of faith from the Bible that are messy, and yet they're beautiful because of the mess, not in spite of it. And so we're asking people from our church to share some of their own stories of messy faith. So we've heard over the last 3 weeks, 3 different voices, 3 different perspectives, 3 different stories. And this week, we get to hear one more. This week from Eva Collier. Eva, are you prepared to come up here? Let's give Eva a hand as she comes up. Thank you for your willingness to be up here. This is not for everybody, and that's okay. We had Grant up here last week, and he just talked for like 15, 20 minutes. I didn't cut him off. He knew that he needed to cut himself off. And other people are less comfortable, and that is completely fine.
And that's
so
me.
It is a huge deal that Eva's up here today. So we're going to give her a huge round of applause on her way out, too. So we sent out a list of questions, and some of our folks have stayed strictly those questions. People like Grant, and we'll have others later who are like, they're telling their own thing, and that's completely fine. But a couple questions that we did send out that seem to speak to you really profoundly in your own story of messy faith. The first one is, what should we know about your experience and perspective of faith?
So I grew up in the South with a pretty strict religious background. My dad was Catholic and my mom was Southern Baptist. And I know most people are pretty familiar with Catholicism, but Southern Baptist is actually even more dogmatic in a lot of ways. My parents insisted on parochial schools all the way up until high school. And Southern Baptist schools have a really long list of forbidden things that keep you out of heaven. There's no mixed swimming past the age of like 4th grade. It supposedly puts ideas into your head about members of the opposite sex. There's no dancing, so no proms or anything like that. Definitely no alcohol consumption or anything like that. But one of the biggest things was being gay. That doesn't matter what your faith is or how much you believe in God. That would exclude you from heaven. And I was raised on that as bread and butter. Well, fast forward to college, I was exposed to multiple friends. I had moved up north by then, had best friends who were gay, or just identified within the LGBT community in different ways. I went and saw a movie that really just changed my life. It was called Philadelphia, and I realized how wrong that was. I ended up breaking off a relationship with someone I was engaged to because it changed my beliefs so much. Fast forward a few more years, and I'm married and have kids, and my dad, who was my best friend, passed away. And it just completely broke me, shook my world. He was one of those people that loves you no matter what. He knew every bad thing about me and still thought I was a great person anyway. Not long after the funeral, I finally put all these little things together that I had missed during his life and realized that my dad was gay, that he had spent 40 years married to a woman and never felt complete, romantically. It completely shocked me. I was angry at first because how could you have raised me with that religious upbringing that being gay was so wrong? I mean, we had arguments about it. It just completely shook me to the core, and it made me question everything that he had raised me with religiously. And then later, when I came to accept it more, it broke my heart that he felt like I couldn't have loved him had I known. It broke my heart for my mom, who now has dementia and blessedly doesn't remember, because she did later find out after he had passed. So of course it hurt her as well. Now she doesn't remember any of that, and she's back to they had a happy marriage. So there are some blessings in dementia and Alzheimer's. It took a long time to forgive all of that and to make peace with all of that and to find my way back to God after all of that. Fast forward up to that, my marriage ended, and that's enough to make you question your faith in God as well. And I was still very much involved with the same church. In my head and my heart, I didn't question that God couldn't love you if you weren't gay. And yet I was still attending a church that very much preached hate. I just didn't think of it that way. I thought that was the normal thing, that, everybody who went there knew that it was okay. But I didn't think that the people that you see on the news holding signs saying God hates, I won't say that word in church, I didn't think that those were the same people that I was going to church with. Well, my marriage ended, and blessedly, I wasn't going to that church anymore. I felt like I got to make my own choices. Unfortunately, that meant that I kind of fell away from church for a while. When Matthew and I found each other, I think he was maybe looking for something outside of Catholicism that welcomed a little less dogma. And we found a church that we both really liked. We loved the music. We liked a lot of the people there. And it was non-denominational, which was very, very wonderful as well. I should throw in that at some point along this way of raising children, my middle child had told me that he identified as bisexual. And I felt so proud as a parent that he could tell me that. And my daughter told me that she became as pansexual. And again, just felt super proud that they felt like they could tell me that because of the history with my dad. The church that we were going to, I absolutely loved the music. It still breaks my heart, like at Christmas time, that we're not there, because music is just the way into my heart. And I miss what they did at the holidays. But we reached a point where one Sunday where it was almost a tirade against, they wouldn't actually say gay, but alternative lifestyles. And basically that you were going to hell for that. And it finally hit me that I was doing to my kids what had been done to me, and that I was essentially telling them by continuing to go to churches that were saying that, I was forever affecting how they thought of God and church and religion. That I was sitting there silently and agreeing with it, even though I had taught them that it was okay, that God loves everybody, that that's the silliest thing in the world to think that God couldn't love you for that. But there I am sitting silently in agreement and giving my hard-earned money to a church that espouses that. So for me, that was a really big coming to Jesus moment, I guess, of what I've done to my own kids. And I'm trying desperately to get my own daughter to come back to church now. I don't know that I'll ever be able to get my middle son to come back. And I blame myself because I just did what my parents had kind of thoughtlessly done all those years. I feel a lot of shame for sitting there in silent agreement, which is kind of what I see going on in the news with what's happening with police brutality. I kind of skipped ahead because I'm super nervous and I'm not good at this stuff.
Great. It's your story.
But yeah, that's how we found our way to the Grove. I've never felt so welcomed and so allowed to be who I am, for my kids to be who they are, and I'm hoping that eventually they're going to fully understand how welcome and how okay it is to be here, and that God loves them just as they are, just like I do.
How do you did skip ahead. That's completely fine. We don't need to stick to the questions. Now that you're at this point, where do you see God at work now in and through you, in and through Matthew, in and through your family even? And maybe like where's your hope going forward?
Just continuing to grow here. I can't believe the size of the congregation from a year ago. And I'm curious to see where we're going to be in another year. I think that the love that we all have for each other and the faith that we're building is amazing. People need to see this.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to share while you've got the microphone and while all the eyes are on you?
No, I think that's enough.
Okay. Eva, what a beautifully messy story. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for getting up here and just pouring it out. Let's give her a hand. We have 3 more weeks, 3 more stories. I was going to say just like hers. Not at all like hers, and that's the beautiful thing about it. We all have our own messy stories, and each of them is different, and each of them is profound in their own ways. We've been talking a lot this month about stories and how they get told and how they get transmitted and why even they get transmitted and handed down, and how that's even a process that we go through ourselves, or people in telling stories go through themselves, that these stories are constructed and they're done so for a reason. Well, one of our big stories that we have as people of the United States is the founding of our country, right? And we have this story that has been told to us and handed down to us, and it's like set in our heads because it's our shared story. And so when you mess with that story a little bit, it becomes a little unsettling for understandable ways. It's not the story always that has been handed down to us. So one of the ways that this happened in the last couple of years, in 2019, New York Times Magazine shared this thing called the 1619 Project, which was written by a bunch of black authors, and it was from the perspective saying, what if we thought about the founding of our country not as something that happened by a bunch of white landowners and slave owners in 1776, but maybe we thought about the founding of our country, the beginning of the country that we now know it, happening in 1619. And in 1619, this is when the arrival of the first slaves came to the United States. Maybe that is the filter through which we can understand our country and the founding of our country as it is. Well, that's different from the story that has been handed down to us, right? That's different from the story that I was told. And there were a lot of people who were, some people were like, oh my goodness, this is amazing, this is revolutionary. There were other people who are like, this is strange because, but there were people on this end who are like, this is wrong. This is not the story that has been handed down to us. This is not the story that is ours. It started in 1776 in this way. And then there were tons of people in the middle who were like, this is strange because it's not the story that has been handed down to us. Now, what do we do with it? Like an innocent, not sure what to do with it because it was an alternative to a story that had been handed down that was well-worn and familiar. This is something that happens with the Bible often as well, and is going to happen with the story that we talk about today as a part of this series. Now, we're in the middle of this series, a beautiful mess, looking at these heroic stories of messy faith. And we have been sharing stories like that of Eva, people from our congregation sharing their own messy stories of faith, but then also looking to the book of Hebrews, and specifically to chapter 11 in the book of Hebrews, where the author shares stories of heroes of the faith. It was like stories of these people that everybody can agree upon. Everybody knows these stories. Everybody who would have found this book, who've been handed this book, been reading this book, would have said, oh, I know these people from our past. And the author does so because, not because their stories are well polished, but because they're messy. And the point being, if those people's messy stories can be celebrated now as heroic stories, maybe we can find our own stories of messy faith to be heroic as well. And so we get these stories of people like Abraham and Moses, and they get like full paragraphs in this chapter, Hebrews 11, about the heroic things that they did. And then there's stories of people like Isaac, who we talked about last week, who gets 3 sentences, and mostly they're about someone other than Isaac. Half of it's about what his dad did to him, and the other half is about what his kids adopted down from him, but he at least gets 3 sentences. Well, there's this other chunk of stories that get told where it's kind of understood that you already know these stories. So today we're going to talk about David, and this is the mention that David gets in Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11:32. And what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets. Catch that? So it's like the author of Hebrews, after laying out all of these heroes, telling their full stories, he gets to these ones, he's like, I'm not going to waste my time or yours telling you about these people because you know their stories. You know how it plays out. You know how they're heroic. I'm not going to waste my time or yours. Well, I'm going to waste your time today talking about David and pulling apart his story a little bit. One, because you might not know it. And secondly, because there's maybe an alternative history of David that we need to pay attention to that speaks to some of the cracks in his own story and highlights the messiness of faith that might connect to our stories as well. If you've grown up in church, grew up in a church tradition, you know David. If you did not grow up in a church tradition, if you have no faith background whatsoever, you've probably heard of David before. This is the David of David and Goliath fame. The little boy who takes on a giant, right? David and Goliath is this story that gets told even about like sports teams. It's the underdog that defeats the all-powerful team that's won all of these championships. David's story is a familiar one. And we also know a lot of, and are have been handed down, a lot of the little pieces of David's heroic story. So we might know things like David was a shepherd. David was a forgotten youngest son in this large family. David was a warrior, that he was brave enough to take on a giant, right? David was a humble poet. He wrote all of these songs in the book of Psalms. David was a model king. When you think about a king of Israel, someone that you wanted to be like, if you were going to be in a royal role, you wanted to be like David. David was this model king. And we're even handed down this story about David, that David was a man after God's own heart. If you're going to model yourself in faith, in your connection to God, you want to be like David. This is the story, or the individual stories that get handed down to us about David. And so in a series about messy faith, when you hear about David, King David, if you're familiar with that type of story, you might be thinking, wait, I thought we were talking about messy faith. His story sounds pretty polished, doesn't it? Right? Well, maybe not so much. Once again, one of the things to remember about stories is they get told for a reason. Stories, whether they're stories for the Bible or stories that we read today, maybe even movies that we watch today, they are told in a certain way for a certain reason, choosing certain things and ignoring certain things in order to craft a narrative. This is just the way that we work. We can't tell everything that's happening in every single moment. That's not the way that we work. That's not the way that stories work. And so we have to pick and choose what we're going to tell about a story and how we are going to tell it in order to convey something to the people that we are telling this story to. Well, the same is true with David and with any of these biblical stories. The biblical authors were crafting a story and handing it down in such a way to say something important about this person and this story that was being told. So when it comes to David, one of the scholars of the life of David, his name is Joel Baden, not Joe Biden, Joel Baden. He is a professor at the Yale Divinity School, and he literally wrote the book on David. The book is called The Historical David, The Real Life of an Invented Hero. What Joel Baden says about the story of David is that the story of David is an apology. Now, it's not an apology in that it is like apologizing for something that was done wrong. An apology, like when it's a part of a story, is that it is crafting, that it is trying to explain something that happened, and often it's trying to explain away something negative that happened. So this is what Joel Baden says, Dr. Joel Baden says about the story of David. He says, I think that the story of David is doing something, I think what the story of David is doing is it's taking observable known things about its main character, David, and then going to great lengths to tell us, but I promise it's not as bad as it looks. So all of the things that I previously mentioned, these are the good things that have been handed down to us about the life of David. And it doesn't necessarily mean that those things didn't happen. And it doesn't necessarily mean that we avoid those things, but instead what it means is that David is a little bit more complicated than we have sometimes been led to believe. And so there was a need for an apology to be written. You might even think of an apology as like a spin. So what is the spin on the life and the story of David that we get handed down, or that you have been told even, that I was told even about the life of David? Well, the spin you might think of is that David didn't want to be king. He never wanted to be king. He never wanted all of this power and prominence, but he only did so because the king before him and the king's son died. And then he just, I guess he had to be king, and I guess he just had to have all of this power. and influence. This is the spin that gets shown to David. And yet, when we actually dig into the story, it's quite a bit more complicated than that and quite a bit convenient for David to be put in that position. We are about a year, just under a year, from when the war in Ukraine started. And many of us are able to follow along with all of the events coming out of Ukraine and the war that's going on in Ukraine. And yet something else has happened that's connected to Ukraine and to Russia over the past year that has been kind of like an epidemic. And it's actually spread to different parts of the world, not just in Ukraine or Russia. And it's this epidemic called sudden Russian death syndrome. Have any of you heard this? Okay, so sudden Russian death syndrome is this wild phenomenon where these prominent people are just suddenly dying of like falling out of windows and just suddenly falling down stairwells and dying of like randomly consuming things that are poison. Or dying by murder-suicide when there were no other signs. Now, you don't need to worry about this, probably, because unless you are a Russian dissident that has been critical of the war in Ukraine, you probably don't have the symptoms that would lead you to having sudden Russian death syndrome. These things are just randomly happening, right? It's like funny because it's so absurd, and it's sad because it's so absurd that these people are just randomly dying because they happen to be critics of the Kremlin. Something sneakingly suspicious, sneakily similar happened to people who were around David. David didn't want to be king. David didn't do anything in order to be king. He just happened to be in this position. Well, it just so happens that as you follow the life of David, people around him die quite often. And it just so happens that all of these people who die happen to be in positions where he now gets to benefit from their deaths. Just happens in that way, right? So there's like this sudden Israeli death syndrome that is following David around. What's really peculiar about the life of David, though, as we think about some of this stuff, is that those cracks, those things like a sudden Russian death syndrome that are surrounding David if we pay attention to his story, they don't get avoided. They actually get included if we pay attention to them. They get included in the story that is being told about David, and they get included in the apology, in the spin. So we do get handed this plate of things that are really positive about David. You know, he's a shepherd. He's this youngest son who like raises up the ranks. He's this brave warrior. He's this model king. He's this one after God's own heart. All of these good things. But then we also get told all of these not great things about David, like all of these people who happened to die around him, and every one of their deaths just happened to be of benefit to him. These things like, David was actually a womanizer. David ends up having 8 different wives. He could have had more than that, but he ends up leaving them. There's stories explicitly in the telling of his story that talk about David being a rapist. Like, this is right in the text. David, between the time when he kills Goliath and then becomes king, he actually goes and works for the Philistines, who are Israel's enemies, and he's a mercenary. Do you know this? And also, he's a really crummy dad. So he has 8 wives, he has a bunch of kids, he's a crummy dad, and it ends up being the case where a couple of his kids try to orchestrate a coup against him. This is the story that we have of David. We have these really good things, but we also have these really bad things. And the people who are writing his story and including it in the Bible and handing it down, they don't say, we're just going to focus on the polish. They actually, in their spin of the life of David, include all of these bad things as well. So then the question becomes, for us people living 2,000 years later who are handed down this story, what do we do with that and what do we make of David? So my question is, was David good or was David bad? I'd be really interested to ask that question of you and kind of get the responses. Was David good or was David bad? We're often told that he was good, man after God's own heart, but we have all these bad things, really bad things as well, right? Was he good or was he bad? You know what my answer is? Yes. David was good and he was bad. David did some really good things that are worth celebrating, and he did some really bad things that as we look back on them now, and if we lived in the situation then, we'd be able to say, they were really bad. We can say David was complicated. Walt Whitman, who was this famous poet, one of these really famous lines that he has where he talks about being a complicated person, and he says, I am large and I contain multitudes. David was large and David contained multitudes. He was capable of both good and bad. And yet what we have in this character that balances those two things, what we find is that David is worthy of an apology. He's worthy of a spin. He's worthy of an explanation for how he is both good and bad. He's worthy of being handed down despite all these things as a hero of the faith. And what we eventually hear is that he is worthy of being tied to Jesus himself. Jesus is called not only the Son of God, Son of Man, but also a Son of David. Not just like you need to know this about Jesus, but it's like a point of pride that Jesus was a son of David, even and despite all of these cracks in his story. So my wondering is also whether we all deserve an apology for ourselves too. Whether we can all recognize, you know what, we have good and we have bad. We are capable of good things and we are capable of bad things. And the good news is that we are not resigned to or defined by either of those things. That the grace of God is present in us, and that if we pay attention to it, it can work in and through us. There's nothing that you can do to earn the grace of God, the goodness of God in you. There's nothing that you can do to negate the goodness of God, to make it go away. And so the job of our lifetime is to believe that that is true, to acknowledge it, and then to respond to it. To say, I have these things at work within me, and I am going to do my best to focus on the good going forward at the expense of the bad. Not like it's a tally, where if we get enough tallies on this side, then we'll negate the other ones. Not like it's a weight where if we weigh it enough on the good, then the bad goes away, but that it's like a step forward. We will take step backs, but we can always move forward in the right direction. And the best thing about this is that we are not alone in this work. This church, the Grove, exists to be a community of faith in the best way possible for both of those words. We're a community of people who are saying, this is difficult, messy work, and we can do this better together, even and especially in the mess. And yet we are also a community of faith saying we are not alone in this, even as people together, but we believe that God is at work in and through us, allowing us and empowering us to do better going forward. So with that in mind, as individuals who contain multitudes. May we believe in, acknowledge, and respond to the grace of God at work within us. And as a community of faith, may we embrace the work that God is doing in and through us. May that be so.
Will your grace run out if I let you down? 'Cause all I know is how to run. I am a sinner. If it's not one thing, it's another. Caught up in words, tangled in lies.
Once again, it was wonderful to be with you on this morning. So good to be able to tell these stories, and especially to hear the stories like Eva's. Can we give Eva a hand one more time? This is like way out of her comfort zone, and she knocked it out of the park. As we go, I've got one quick announcement before we go. Again, Pajama Ball's coming up. That's not the announcement for today, but I do want to stick that in your brains again. The one more thing is our next partner gathering, our hello and welcome. If you're curious about the Grove and what it means to partner with us, again, that's happening on February 12th. It's going to happen immediately after worship in this space. I realized this morning that February 12th is Super Bowl Sunday. Super Bowl's not until the evening. Do not use that as an excuse, okay? Unless you're like my dad and you watch 12 hours of, I don't know, maybe you do. You watch 12 hours of Super Bowl coverage. We can have a separate conversation about that. We hope if you consider this to be your church home, we'd love for you to be able to be a part of that and learn more about what it means to be a partner. With that, I will have you stand up as you are able and extend your hands to receive the blessing as we go out into this chilly but beautiful Minnesota Sunday. As we go as individuals who contain multitudes, may we believe in, acknowledge, and to respond to the grace of God at work within us. And as a community of faith, may we embrace the work that God is already doing in and through us. May that be so. Amen.